Well, I feel very humbled to be here tonight and to share this group, and I think that what I'll do hopefully is to share some stories from my experience and my role. And I kind of have one of those interesting job titles because it's unique and different because my job title is Director of Mission and Corporate Relations. So on one level I have this title which is about mission, and it's for us about embedding our values and our reason for being. And then on the other side I have the corporate relations of our organisation, which in Sydney is 6 hospitals, 6 facilities across the whole of Sydney, the primary campus in Darlinghurst at St Vincents, the Mater in Sydney and St Joseph's in Auburn, including aged care and a subacute hospital. And then we're part of a much broader family as St Vincent's Health Australia across the eastern seaboard. But I kind of love this whole area, particularly talking about values. I think it's certainly for us at the heart and soul of our organisation. We talk about it a lot. But it always worries me when you talk about things a lot because there's a great story. I remember a former boss of mine told me that he was checking in at a 5-star hotel in Sydney, and as he was standing at the counter waiting, there was a gentleman next to him who had just flown in from the States. And as he was checking in, he said to the guy who was doing his check-in, he said, he leaned over and said, "Can you tell me where I might get some drugs?" And the guy behind the counter said, "Excuse me?" And he said, "Can you tell me where I might be able to buy some drugs?" And he looked around and he said, "I'm not sure. What were you looking for?" And he said, "Well, I need to buy some drugs and I need to know where I can go to buy them." And he said, "You must have a shop that sells them." And the young man said, we don't really have shops that sell drugs. And he said, "Well, where do you get your drugs from?" And he said, "Well, I'm not sure." And he said, "You've got to have a shop that sells drugs." And so the young man, who thought he was doing the right thing in customer service, leaned over very closely, whispered, looked around, whispered and said, "Look, I'm not sure, but if you talk to Peter, the piano player in the front bar, he might be able to help you." At which time my friend leant over and said, "I have to interrupt because I think this gentleman's actually looking for a pharmacy or a chemist and he wants to buy some prescription drugs." And where the young man said, "Oh, I'm awfully sorry," but my friend said he thought he'd better go up to the bar and check out what Peter looked like in the front bar and he might be telling it. I think it's a great story because I think words are often very powerful things, but they mean different things to different people. And I think often we use words in ways that we assume meaning. And I think not only do we do that as individuals, but I think organisations have a habit of doing that as well. And I think how often is there a disconnect between what the staff think is being meant from what the executives might mean, or even the board or the CEO. And this disconnect can often be a very significant and powerful thing. How do we understand, and I think for me, we take people on the journey. And in our organisation, we have this term we use all the time, "they get it." But you know very clearly when you see someone who doesn't get it. And it's our challenge and our role is how do you take even those people on the journey. My job often in our organisation is to talk about values and to get, particularly in our organisation, we have about 6,500 staff right across all of our facilities, and that doesn't include the doctors who would come into our private hospitals. But we have a huge number of people, and that isn't even touching the patients and the clients that walk through our doors every day, 365 days a year, 24/7 business. We never shut down. I came from, my background originally was in schools, and we used to have this great thing, pupil-free days. We'd love that because, we'd say the schools are so much better without the kids. But in hospitals, we don't ever have that luxury. It's frenetic. And if you think about our emergency department just up the road here at Darlinghurst, it's one of the busiest emergency departments in Australia. It is a melting pot of humanity that walk through our doors. So when I'm talking to staff, and we're engaged with orientation induction, which is so important for us from all levels in our organisation. But when I remember thinking about how do you embed, when I first started we had 8 values, and we've just changed it down to 4, which has been an interesting process. But I used to think, how on earth do you talk about connecting values when you've got 8 of them? And for me, the worry is that they're just words. I mean, they're just, you know, you put them up, you frame them, you put the front of the annual report, and you say, there they are, often paying consultants a lot of money to help you write them. And so, but I remember I lived in the United States for a while. I did my master's in the States, and I left just post 9/11. And when 9/11 happened, for me, it touched very closely because I had friends of mine who worked in the lower end of Manhattan. My business partner at the time was in the States. I have lots of friends and family in the US. And I remember that moment of, you know, that night of trying to contact people and to see if people I knew had been affected. And luckily, no one that I knew directly was impacted, although one of my friends did have someone that they lost in that incident. But one of the things that happened to me was that the first anniversary, and some of you will have seen it because it's been repeated, but there was a telemovie on the last flight that was hijacked that day, was Flight 93, which went down in a field in Pennsylvania. And it was an extraordinary act of bravery from those passengers on the plane who boiled water and took the meal carts and tried to overpower terrorists in the plane. And that flight went down in a greenfield site in Pennsylvania. But the thing that struck me about it, and I think this is what resonated with me, was the phone calls from the plane to the ground. From the passengers who knew probably fairly clearly their destiny because it was they were the last plane to be hijacked. But the telemovie was put together from the phone calls. And most of those planes had phones at the back of the seat and people had mobiles. And you know, when you listen to the conversations and you think about what those people, who they chose to call, and if you think about that for a moment, I mean, who would you call if you had been on that flight? And what would you say to them in those moments? I mean, it's a pretty confronting thought. And in that movie, there were some moments when people didn't say a thing. They just listened to each other breathe. And there was another extraordinary moment where one of the operators in the flight centre, who was on the phone to the passenger, prayed with her in that moment. Well, you know, if you want to know what you value in your life, if you want to know what's deep inside of you in terms of values, it will tell you who you call. And it will define what you say. It will influence who you ring and what you say. Because I think that our personal values come from deep inside of us. And they always end up as an action. They always influence how we make choices, how we behave. And we learn them in different ways, from our parents, from our siblings. We learn them from our friends. We learn them through good times, and we also learn them through shadow times. In all of those experiences, they begin to form. And they start to shape how we make choices and decisions. And I think that, you know, the values, when you understand values, the apparent significance of them, they are incredible drivers in our life. And there's a great quote from Susan Haverfield, she's an author, about success in life and work. And she says, living your values is one of the most powerful tools available to you to help you be the person you want to be, to help you accomplish your goals and dreams, and to help you lead and influence others. It comes deeply from your personal values. And so I think that what happens is that then organisations, believe it or not, have this metamorphosis the same way. I think if you know, because businesses can talk about their values, but you often see action can be quite different. And this is what we're challenged about all the time. Because in healthcare, I don't need to tell you, probably can guess because you read the papers, it's tough. We run public and private hospitals. You would never go into the businesses if you wanted to make money. You know, in the public hospital, there's never enough money, and in the private hospitals, the business is so tough. It's a challenge. But and I'm going to come back to it, because in our foundation stories, they are the things that cause all the time back to you, what is hope in our organisation? What is compassion? What is care? But I want to share with you, because my first job that I had prior to this one, I was at the University of Notre Dame in Fremantle. I was on the foundation staff. When I began, we had 0 students, we were a planning office. And the very first time I started, when I first began, it was amazing because we were in a state of crisis from the beginning. Absolute state of crisis. With the government, with funding, not a thing. There was sign of hope. And I remember the Vice Chancellor at the time got us together in a room, a small group of us, got us together and sat us in a circle, and he said, it's desperate. And he said, so we need to sit here and we need to pray and we need to think, help us to survive. And I remember it was an incredibly powerful moment in that circle. And it was something ignited for me in that moment that said, we will survive. Because this was an important and noble thing that we were doing. And we cut our teeth on that as an organisation, on that belief. And, and so I was with that university as it grew and developed in Perth, and we established a reconciliation campus in Broome, which was extraordinary with Aboriginal communities in the Kimberley. And when I came to Sydney, I remember just after I started, there was a rumour going around that Notre Dame was going to start here, and I was sitting in a meeting, and I remember the 2 people with me said, well, what a load of rubbish that is, that'll never work here. And I remember inside of me, I thought, you want to bet? Because I thought to myself, I knew deep down what the values were in that organisation that would make it want to survive. And I think because our stories, and this is one of the important things, our stories, and I don't care whether you're Notre Dame or St Vincents, whether you're Qantas or whether you're NAB, we have stories about why we were founded, who founded us, who are we there for, who are we and why are we here. And in knowing your story and your foundation, it gives you some sense in your story of what were the values that were cut in this organisation that made it great, or that made it struggle, or what it was to suffer and how you dealt with suffering. I love Jeff sharing in that talk about, when it's tough, how do the values get lived out? The values don't always cause us to be nice. They cause us to work with integrity and to make choices that where people matter most. Where people matter most. And people know when they get it. I have to tell you a great story because it really shares it. We have at Sacred Heart, many of you know Darlinghurst, used to be called Sacred Heart Hospice. It's not just called a hospice anymore because we have rehab and a number of other services. But for the most part, it's done an extraordinary history of caring for people who are facing death and dying. There's a great story of one of the sisters. The sisters are our teachers. They are the custodians of our story. Now, sadly for us, very, very few of them left. So it's our job to hold their story. But one night, one of the sisters, and she was a bit of a toughie, she was an older one, really tough, she was on the front desk on the phone, and the phone rang. The person rang and said, is that Sacred Heart Hospice for the dying? And she said, no, you've got the wrong number. And she said, sure, this isn't the number for Sacred Heart Hospice for the dying. And she said, no, you've got the wrong number. And he said, I'm sure this is the number for Sacred Heart Hospice for the dying. And she said, no, this is Sacred Heart Hospice for the living. A very important story about the sacredness of life and about the journey of life right through to the joy, through the hopes, through the despair, through the suffering, but most importantly about the humanity. And I think when you find people who touch the values and the meaning in such a powerful way, it's shared with so many people. And it doesn't matter whether you're for a profit, whether you're for not-for-profit, we all have the opportunity to make a difference. To somehow make that point at which we encounter people. And by the way, I'm not just talking about our customers, I'm talking about our staff and our people. If you want to see something, I remember one of the things I learned at my MBA, which was pretty incredible, because some of you in the room, I don't need to tell you about, you probably look up the Fortune 500 companies, very impressive list. If you want to really look at something interesting, in this room people would be interested, look up the Fortune 100 best companies to work for in the world. They publish that every year. It's just come out, 2013. Look at the list. I did it the other day and went through each company, they linked to their website. And look at look at the things that repeat, and look at the qualities of these organisations that are held up as organisations people want to work for, they want to be associated with, they want to be proud of. And you know, for most of us, most of our waking hours are at work. We want to feel good about what we do. We want to be a part of something that we feel makes a difference. That somehow we're contributing to something greater than just ourselves. And in some of those companies, you'll find that tag. What are they doing to make that difference? And I think for me, and I work in the business of where there is often despair, where there is often suffering, where there's often death. But I tell you what, we're in the business of hope, and we're in the business of compassionate care, and we're in the business of being there with people, in giving them moments where they can think that life is worthwhile. And I think we can all be that for others. Our world, when you pick up a newspaper, when you put on the TV set, is full of despair. In our organisations, in our businesses, we need to be signs of hope. When we connect our values and our story powerfully, we can make that difference.